We're gonna get started here. So I'm really glad to have you all with us here tonight. This year's series on sexing science, gendering technology has been great. It's really exceeded my expectations. The speakers have been great. The attendance has been wonderful, including tonight. There's a lot of people here. I'm really happy about that. And incredible enthusiasm and engagement from the audience. So I'm up here patting myself on the back a little bit. But I partially, it's the work of the wonderful speakers and the wonderful audiences that's made that possible. We've had, from the brain to video games to diversity in science and engineering fields to psychology to comic books and tonight to biomedical research, genetics, epigenetics. Our speakers have explored the issues, the ways that gender informs and valences science, medical research, technological development, and we're going to see a little bit more of that tonight. I have to say some thank yous. This is our last lecture of this series, and you're in for a real treat. We've had a lot of sponsors, co-sponsors, supporters helping us out with this series. Our co-sponsors on tonight's lectures include the Gallerstein's Women's Center and the Gender Studies Program, who've also helped us out with previous speakers, Liz Elliott included. We've also had help with different speakers, support with different speakers from the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Texas. We've had a lot of wonderful student supporters, student volunteers who've come and helped us out from Arts and Humanities, Behavioral and Brain Sciences, the Women's Center, the Rainbow Guard. So it's really appreciate the help from the student volunteers, most of whom are outside still volunteering and helping, but so my thanks to all of them. Now I'm going to welcome to the stage Professor Pamela Gosson of the School of Arts and Humanities and the director of our program in Medical and Scientific Humanities to introduce our speaker. So please join me in welcoming her.
So there are brochures out there. I never leave home without them. So anyone who is actually occupying the humanities space who is interested in medical and scientific issues or vice versa, this is the place for you. We actually offer a minor where you can cross over between the two and don't have to choose. So I'm really happy to see you all here as well. Tonight our speaker is Sarah Richardson, who is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard. She has joint appointments, so you know she's one of our kind of people, right? In the Department of the History of Science and also the Committee on Degrees in the Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Her research focuses on race and gender in the biosciences and on the social dimensions of scientific knowledge. Her most recent book is entitled Sex Itself, The Search for Male and Female in the Human Genome, which appeared in 2013 with the University of Chicago Press. And she's also co-editor of Revisiting Race in a Genomic Age and Postgenomics, which is coming out soon with Duke. The working title of her current project is The Maternal Mystique, in which she offers analyses of the history of research on the so-called maternal effects, the influences of a mother's behavior, exposures, and physiology on her offspring's future health and development. Tonight, she's going to be sharing a part of this research with us in her talk, Gender and Science at the Interface of Mother and Fetus. Please help us welcome Dr. Sarah Richardson.
I'm so glad to be here, and thanks for coming out. Can everyone hear me okay? All right, great. So thank you very much for having me and for that introduction, which leads very nicely into my talk. So the 2001 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City caused the deaths of nearly 3,000 people, widespread economic perturbations, a new tide of anti-Arab sentiment in the United States, and the widening of US military interventions in the Middle East. And it was a signal event initiating North Americans into a post-terrorism subjectivity characterized by a pervasive sense of risk and uncertainty about the future. Immediately after the attacks, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology cautioned that pregnant women might be particularly vulnerable to the event's impact. And in the decade that followed, a curious set of findings appeared in the leading journals of public health and human reproduction. Infants in utero at the time of the 9/11 attacks, these studies claimed, bore the mark of the disaster, with implications for future generations to come. One study discerned significantly increased risks for low birth weight among Arabic-named infants in California. Another found distinct birth weight and developmental outcomes among children of lower Manhattan mothers who were pregnant at the time of the attacks and showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Tracking measures of child growth and development that reportedly vary with ambient exposures in utero, scientists argued that anxiety and economic stress induced by 9/11 may have triggered adaptive maternal responses, altering plastic fetal developmental pathways to leave an imprint on the cohort of American infants gestated during the 9/11 attacks. 100 years ago, in the first decades of the 20th century, claims that communal anxiety provoked by an attack could impact the development and future fates of growing fetuses would have been forcefully rejected by most biological scientists and medical doctors. They relegated notions that maternal experiences can imprint on the fetus to the realm of old wives' tales and pre-modern mysticism, and to a minority perceived as fraudulent and pseudoscientific at the time, still clinging to Lamarck's theories of social and environmental inheritance. Today, the science of maternal fetal effects is at the leading edge of biological investigations across the fields of genomics, public health, psychiatry, and reproductive medicine, as new journals, textbooks, conferences, and grant funding, not to mention popular science books and articles that have appeared on the subject just in the past few years attest. As the example of the 9/11 studies suggests, the science of maternal fetal effects has also become one of the fields of speculation through which we understand and process the risk and uncertainty of our complicated world. My question in my current research is how, over the last century, did the maternal-fetal interface come to be figured as a sensitive biological barometer of our social environment? And how did the maternal body become a focus as a potentially amplifying vector for transgenerational non-genetic impacts? So I'm looking at this history by tracking the history of the science of something called maternal effects. Maternal effects, strictly speaking, refer to the influence of the maternally provided environment on the phenotype or outcomes of her offspring. So collectively, maternal effects research argues that a mother's experiences, behaviors, and physiology, inflected by her social and environmental context, can have life-altering effects on fetal development and early infancy, as well as, and researchers claim as well, that they can represent a biologically important but non-genetic form of inheritance, potentially refracting the mother's experiences and exposures across generations of descendants. Now, maternal effects science enters a charged debate about sex differences in contribution to reproduction. Do the male and female contribute the same amount of hereditary factors to the next generation? Back at the turn of the 20th century, when the chromosomal theory of inheritance was being discovered and Mendel's laws of inheritance were being unraveled, the message was the mother and father contribute identically and equally to the offspring. Or does one parental gender contribute more? Does the mother or the father contribute more is more important to the next generation? This is a sex difference claim, and the implications of it are hard to tease out. Like more familiar sex difference claims about brains, hormones, genitals, chromosomes, sex difference claims about who gives more to the next generation invoke narratives that are imbued with social meaning of difference, hierarchy, complementarity, social order. They don't have any stable or straightforward meaning or implications for men and for women, but they can, as narratives, be flexibly invoked by those with social authority to support an array of positions, feminist, anti-feminist, or what have you. So that is, maternal claims about maternal effects mark the return of a very old intellectual and social provocation. I'm going to begin this lecture, if you'll let me try out the big picture with you. This lecture takes us back to the earliest history of theories of heredity and reproduction that invoked the idea that the mother gives more to the next generation, and then drops into the mid-20th century when this new science of maternal effects begins to quicken and pick up after 50 years or so of latency, and then takes us all the way up to the present, discussing the current science of epigenetics, to give you a sense of historical sweep of the kinds of claims that have been made over time and their various contexts. Now, the idea that a woman may leave a biological trace on her gestating offspring has long been a commonplace folk intuition and a matter of scientific intrigue. Until the late 19th century, expert and common knowledge held that a pregnant woman's emotions and experiences can imprint on the fetus, leading to features such as birthmarks, deformities, and distinctive personality traits. These theories are collectively known as maternal impressions theories, and they held that a mother's thoughts, her emotions, her milieu, her diet impress on the growing fetus, influencing its future physiognomy, character, and life prospects. The power of maternal emotional lability, visual encounters, and beliefs and intentions to impress or imprint upon fetal appearance and health, you can see this throughout medieval and early modern Western medical canons, and this has been very well documented by historians of science. Maternal impressions theories asserted a special contribution of the maternal-fetal relation to heredity and development. They offered explanations for the tragedy of so-called monstrous births. They explained the occasional offspring that did not resemble the presumed father. They provided a common-sense explanation of the inscription of social experiences and psychological processes on body and biology. Teratology, the theological, scientific, and medical study of so-called monstrous births, first took root in the 15th and 16th century, and it became a central collection point for cases of maternal and paternal impressions. However, while there could be paternal impressions, and rare stories of it do exist in the historical record, the consistent conviction in early modern and pre-modern texts is that the maternal imprint is always more powerful or influential than the paternal one. Presenting the space between a pregnant woman and her growing fetus as an inscriptive, socially imbued environment with implications for the adult offspring and for generations to come, maternal impressions theories reveal deep entanglements with reproductive and gender politics. Now, this terrain has been well examined by historians and gender scholars, among others. On the one hand, the theory of maternal impressions appears to attribute greater power and agency to the maternal body in reproduction and heredity than has historically been the case. Maternal impressions suggest an intimate and subversive female power that is resistant to masculine incursion, control, or knowledge. But this agential reading of maternal impressions is complicated by the theory's conception of the maternal body as irrational and indeed more of a passive conveyor than an agential shaper of fates, and by the theory's role in historically producing regimes of surveillance of pregnant women's bodies. Maternal impressions theories presumed and promoted a conception of the female body as one that is porous, unstable, and irrational, a notion of femaleness long mobilized to argue for women's intellectual inferiority and lack of full claim to male rights, roles, and spaces. Women's fleeting visual impressions, emotions, and imaginative flights, according to maternal impressions theory, can permeate them so rapidly and profoundly as to alter fetal development. An idea wedded to a notion of the body as a kind of energetic economy, which pulled women toward reproduction at the expense of brain or intellect. The theory of maternal impressions has been, as Rosie Braidotti, the feminist scholar, has argued, instrumental in creating or strengthening a nexus of stifling imperatives and even, in effect, pressing advice on women. So broadly speaking, these two positions on the implications of maternal impressions for women have vied with one another over time. And in their contestation over whether maternity is the seat of woman's power or of their oppression, these positions will be recognized as inflections of long-standing counterweights within feminist intellectual engagements on the issue of motherhood. Maternal impressions as a cultural and scientific repository for understanding maternal responsibility for and to the fetus did not recede in the late 18th century, as so much as undergo a set of subtle revisions. So we have kind of pre-18th century where what the woman can see, what her emotions are, can directly imprint on and shape the fetus. But in the 19th century, there's a change. There are a lot of quickenings happening around our understanding of anatomy and physiology during this period. And things like the mind-body relation, all of these concepts begin to shift profoundly. The terminology of maternal impressions, though, persisted in medical and folk texts all the way through the 19th century. And in my own work, through careful historical reading, what I'm able to show is that this term during this period references a theory that is very much reformulated from the older kind of maternal impressions. Beginning in the 19th century, following a number of developments in the sciences of anatomy and embryology that shift our understanding of the body, the view that the maternal state of body and mind can directly imprint on the growing fetus was no longer held. In its place came a view that general and pervasive effects of maternal behavior and emotional state can either promote or perturb fetal development. And this became the kind of unquestioned consensus. I want to give a little interesting context to this. In the 19th century, widespread understandings of evolutionary theory tended to presume that heredity, very, very differently than we have thought for most of the 20th century, that heredity was very open to environmental influence and subject to human alteration. So these are what we call social hereditarian beliefs, and they held that things like education, economic status, and moral cultivation could be marked on the body and passed to future generations. The historian of medicine, Charles Rosenberg, has identified the view that mothers and fathers shape their offspring differently as one principal component of 19th century social hereditarian thought. According to Rosenberg, emphasis upon the role of the mother in shaping her child's ultimate psychic and physical health grew markedly in the 19th century. Many authors before this period actually placed little emphasis on the role of the mother during gestation. She was kind of the nurturant incubator in which the father's seed matured. But the 19th century actually really picked up this discourse and interest in the mother's responsibility and defined her responsibility as all-inclusive, and the father's role is relatively minor and limited to the moment of conception. Medical journals record a surprising number of published case reports of so-called maternal impressions all the way up to the turn of the 20th century. And this evidences the continued investigation of the phenomenon and its credibility as a going scientific question and medical encounter. So in this 1888 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, entitled Monstrosities and Maternal Impressions, the physician R.B. Jessup writes, "Whether maternal impressions do or do not influence fetal development is a question still before the profession. Though we may not offer an explanation of maternal impressions, yet that is no argument against the existence of such influences." Here's a 1900 article from The Lancet, it's kind of the British JAMA, by obstetrician William Duncan, arguing that maternal impressions must be considered real, even though, quote, "the action cannot be explained pathologically." And in these debates, you have this really fundamental debate about what it is we can know and what we should believe. And he ends his plea for scientists to take seriously maternal impressions by quoting the old adage that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. This is the level of the debate. We don't know the mechanisms, we don't have direct evidence for it, but we think we see it everywhere. And a kind of sense of wonder and awe and plausibility about the idea of maternal impressions. Here's a 1903 article from the Journal of the American Medical Association by an Indiana physician, F. Anson Evans, who charged that those who would, quote, "relegate the maternal impression theory to the medical lumber room as a figment of the fancy, ignore the psychological connection between mother and fetus and the effect of environment during the gestatory period." Like the previous article, this author pleads for a science of the maternal-fetal relation that admits the mysterious. He writes, "A mother's makeup is intricate. She is a problem to be solved by no simple rule of mathematics. On her environment hangs the welfare of posterity. Her mental impressions may wonderfully impress the embryo, may mark it, may destroy its harmony, its usefulness, its life." In the early years of the 20th century, theories of maternal impressions and prenatal culture became the target of attacks by scientists and physicians who sought to banish the theory from the scientific literature. This is a really critical turning point. Hundreds of years of maternal impressions theory, and at the beginning of the 20th century, there is a tightening up of the discipline of biology that co-occurs with the arrival of genetic science. And the geneticists were not going to have this maternal impressions theory wafting about anymore in their science. And they seek to banish it. They cast beliefs in maternal impressions as superstitious old wives' tales passed from woman to woman, and as relics of a pre-modern, pre-medical, and pre-empirical approach to human heredity and reproduction. So in the genetics context, of course, you have the turn of the 20th century, the rediscovery of Mendel's laws, the arrival of the chromosomal theory of inheritance, and a conviction that is increasingly shared not only by many scientists but by the wider populace that human characters are determined by heredity, and that the future of human civilization and industry lies in the positive application of the principles of heredity to social improvement. This new genetics asserted that the hereditary factors were sealed in the so-called germ plasm, right, which 50 years later we would understand as the DNA, with no mechanism for the acquisition of traits during an individual lifespan via experiments or experience and environment. Okay. The Journal of Heredity began its campaign against so-called maternal impressions with an editorial by Stanford University president, biologist, and prominent eugenicist David Starr Jordan. Quote, "What can parents do to determine before birth the character of the child?" he wrote. "Nothing, so far as we know, except so to live that the germ cells are not enfeebled and the fetus checked in its period of quiet nutrition. Maternal impressions," he wrote, "was a, quote, spurious science partly based on old wives' tales, denying actual knowledge of actual fact." Here's a 1915 article signed by all the editors of the Journal of Heredity that continued the fight. And I love the title. Maternal impressions. Belief in their existence is due to unscientific method of thought. No evidence whatever that justifies faith in them. How the superstition originated. The essay pinned responsibility for the continuing currency of maternal impressions theory on women's, quote, unscientific method of thought. They wrote, the editors wrote, science wrangles over the rival importance of heredity and environment, and then they parodied women. But we women know what effects prenatal influences work on children. It wasn't just geneticists who were rejecting maternal impressions theory, it was also obstetricians and others working in the reproductive life sciences. So the reproductive physiologists were also transforming their field, methods and theories. They were professionalizing. They had long been kind of contained as obstetricians to the surgeon's gallery and the mother's clinic. But they were seeking footing in the academic enterprise of experimental research science during this period, and combined with a new social interest in technologies like birth control or the management of venereal disease, the reduction of infant mortality and birth defects, this new reproductive physiology joined the broader zeitgeist in urging the replacement of received folk wisdom with scientific expertise, and in promising a brighter future for society as a whole in following the guiding light of science. In this article, The Truth About So-Called Maternal Impressions, written by physician Arch Dixon, published in the Journal of Surgery, Gynecology, and Obstetrics in 1906, we can kind of see their critique. This critique is a detailed analysis and passionate dismissal of the theory of maternal impressions from the standpoint of reproductive science. Dixon's critique shares with those of David Starr Jordan and the Journal of Heredity the conviction that the very progress of empirical science is threatened by continued widespread credence bestowed on women's, quote, superstitious claims about maternal impressions. Indeed, Dixon roundly concludes that given their emotional impressionability and lack of empiricism, if maternal impressions are true, quote, it is a wise provision of nature that the development of the human fetus has not been left to the influence of maternal whims and caprices. Gynecologists and obstetricians' early 20th century excoriations of maternal impressions theory were grounded in up-to-date research on the placental barrier. Very recent advancements in human evolution, embryology, placentology, and teratology, that's the study of birth defects, had just coalesced a newly refined understanding of fetal development within the maternal milieu. And the theory of maternal impressions, Dixon writes, against this backdrop, quote, is a relic of the dark ages and the offspring of superstition. In the evidence of embryological pathology, Dixon writes, quote, we find a key that partially unlocks the mystery and lifts the veil of superstition, which has so long shrouded these eternal impressions. So while maternal impressions or maternal effects theory would live on after this period, kind of at the margins and in women's advice manuals, these critiques were very successful. So you see an almost total exiling of maternal impressions theory from the official medical and scientific literature after this period. And this lasts for about 40 or 50 years, until the mid-20th century, when a new interest in maternal and infant health in the post-World War II era shifts in the social sciences toward thinking of bodies in social context, brought renewed attention to the maternal-fetal relation. In the mid-20th century, medical and social scientists began to think of the womb as a space permeated by the wider physical and social environment. So now I'm going to just take you right forward to that moment, drop in and give you a little sense of that kind of revivification of these beliefs about maternal-fetal effects. I'm going to do this through looking at the biomarker of birth weight. Now, today, birth weight is a signal marker of pregnancy success. In the US, a birth announcement commonly includes birth weight. in precise pounds and ounces, along with just 3 other facts: name of the child, its sex, and its time of birth. Sometimes length as well. Birth weight statistics appear regularly today in national and international data as indices, not just of maternal-fetal health, but things like economic development or gender equality. The story of how birth weight came to be a biomarker portending such great significance and with meaning across so many different social fields is one of the stories that I'll be telling in this book. Now, as historian Lawrence Weaver has documented, use of the infant scale began in the 18th century in some European maternity hospitals as a way of monitoring progress in feeding the infant after birth. So for most of the time, it was used during the first couple of years of life, but not at birth. The first systematic efforts to determine normal birth weights began in the 19th century. And Weaver argues that this practice was linked to the rise of scientific childcare, in which a physician assumed medical responsibility for both mother and the baby. The most important development in the establishment of the biomarker of birth weight, however, was in the realm of vital statistics. In the US, the birth certificate was introduced in 1895. Over time, this document of citizenship became a critical tool in vital public health statistics and more broadly in the field of public health. In the 1940s, the standard form, the standard form began to request medical information as well as basic citizenship. And mostly this information was about the mother's health at time of birth. In 1950, a requirement was added to the standard birth certificate to include birth weight. And so quite immediately you create this measure that you can draw from, okay? Another revision in 1968 requested alongside birth weight a range of socioeconomic information about the parent as well as greater medical information about the newborn infant. And a 1989 revision extended this movement away from maternal health toward infant health, greatly expanding the required reporting of newborn defects on the birth certificate form. So this is the data infrastructure that tracks the explosion in research beginning in the 1960s on maternal-fetal effects during the prenatal period. So in the 20th century, research infrastructures on vital statistics had first formed in relation to public health agendas and health advocacy around prenatal maternal health and the reduction of maternal and infant mortality. And this was immensely successful. By 1970, US infant mortality had declined from a rate of about 1.7% around the turn of the 20th century to a rate of around 0.2%. The incredible success that public health policy and developments in medical science had on the rate of infant mortality in the period up through the 1950s and 1960s is actually part of the context for the rise of birth weight as a leading edge biometric of infant health in the 1960s and 1970s. So though infant mortality would remain, and today remains, a matter of great public health interest, epidemiologists and activists began to shift to a more fine-grained measure of maternal and infant health, okay? Measures that, among other things, that could point to the ongoing need for investment in this area and serve as metrics of further progress. So hence the arrival of a focus on birth weight and the construction of the low birth weight baby. Today, low birth weight is medically defined as a birth weight of 2,500 grams or less than about 5.5 pounds. It's also known as intrauterine growth restriction. Low birth weight is associated with poor outcomes for the infant in areas ranging from lung, liver, and kidney health to behavior and cognition. Though birth weight alone is now considered a controversial biomarker with an indeterminate relationship to future development. African American infants have a rate of low birth weight that is twice that of white American infants. And although rates of low birth weight have declined among all groups over time, the gap has remained consistent for nearly 70 years, during which the sources of this gap have been an object of investigation in several areas of scientific endeavor. And the story of debates over what that cause could be is another story I'll be looking at in the book, and I don't have time to get into right now. But you get a sense of how the social environment entering the prenatal space could be one possible hypothesis. From 1965 to 1980, 4 major US government reports highlight the problem of low birth weight babies. And by 1979, birth weight overtakes infant mortality to become a standard measure in US vital statistics and a major priority area of investment for public health. The shift to birth weight marks a transition from a paradigm of infant and maternal mortality where the focus is on the moment of birth and its most severe complications and implications for both mother and child, to a paradigm focused on the smaller perturbations introduced during the prenatal period and their implications for the later development of the child. So in the book, I look at how in making this shift, the center of interest and intervention moves from the mother per se to the environment, both physical and social, of the growing fetus. This shift began to break down the traditional distinction between what was considered innate, meaning endowed before birth, and what was considered acquired, meaning endowed through learning during the critical period after birth. In short, what I'm saying is the collection of birth weight statistics and the convergence on birth weight as a major indicator or biomarker of society's success in affording maternal infant health and proper prenatal care was a major generative moment in the development of the conception of the womb as a social environment. I want to look at how this worked out within some core theoretical developments in the reproductive sciences. The term intrauterine environment appears intermittently in English language medical literature on fetal growth, at least as early as the 1890s. But it's in the post-World War II period that the term intrauterine begins to be made vivid and palpable by theorists of the phenomenon of low birth weight babies. A critical moment in the creation of the low birth weight baby came with the assertion of a distinction between premature birth and low birth weight. A 1935 resolution of the American Academy of Pediatrics, for example, had defined all low birth weight infants as premature. Quote, "A premature infant is one who weighs 2,500 grams or less at birth, regardless of the period of gestation." Post-World War II theorists pressed the alternative view that low birth weight infants were full-term infants that had failed to thrive and also did not have some obvious congenital defect that would affect their growth. They suggested that some intrauterine environments were less nourishing or more debilitating than others. And this point is affirmed in a series of nomenclature statements by the American Academy of Pediatrics in the late 1960s and early 1970s. I just give some examples here in which expert commissions get together to formally distinguish between what they called retarded intrauterine growth and prematurity. And they set guidelines and metrics for the use of these distinct terms and the documentation of their distinct phenomena. Peter Grunwald, an Austrian-trained physician and placental pathologist at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, was among the key theorists of this concept of restricted intrauterine growth. His 1960s and 1970s work on fetal growth and birth weight helped to place the intrauterine life of the fetus within the care of the pediatrician. And it forged a new vocabulary for animating and visualizing fetal life. Grunwald first became interested in the subject through a variety of studies from the 1930s to the 1950s, showing the effects of famine, wartime trauma, immigration, and socioeconomic status on gross phenomenological variables such as adult height and weight. One widely publicized study, for example, during this period, showed that American-born offspring of Japanese parents were taller as adults than their counterparts born and raised in Japan. So he's thinking about that study. Or another one, for example, showed that private school pupils, presumably coming from a better socioeconomic environment, right, were at the time of entering college 5 centimeters taller and 3 kilograms heavier than those coming from public schools. He's thinking about these studies. And he hypothesizes that, quote, the same is probably true of fetal growth. And he presented birth weight as a new metric of maternal environmental exposures and of socioeconomic factors. And I just find these visuals really, really fascinating and rich to think with. So you see, he actually draws and articulates this window for socioeconomic deprivation and fetal development. The study of intrauterine life, Grunwald proposed, can give an indication of the overall extent of socioeconomic deprivation and may be a, quote, sensitive indicator of change. Fetal growth, he argued, offers a window into the socioeconomic environment of the mother, either at the time of pregnancy or during her development. As Grunwald wrote, quote, at one end of the supply line is the maternal organism, which embodies acute and chronic or residual effects of the environment. Oh, there's the quotes. So Grunwald, as well as other prominent theorists, he's just one of the most prominent and has great diagrams. Theorists of intrauterine life, we call them, during this period, including people like Margaret and Christopher Unstead in Oxford, envision the maternal body as not only itself an environment for the fetus, but as a vector transmitting the wider physical and social environment to the fetus, the effects of which they believed could be seen vividly in the metric of birth weight. In 1966, Unstead and Unstead influentially hypothesized, citing agricultural data, that a mother who herself experienced intrauterine growth restriction would pass this birth weight effect on to her own offspring, creating an intergenerational effect of growth constraint in the maternal line. This further suggested that environmental lesions during intrauterine life, including those originating in socioeconomic deprivation, could grip a family for generations after the acute event. Following Unstead and Unstead, Grunwald then theorized that the delayed effects of what he termed fetal deprivation meant that social interventions could take several generations to overcome the somatic lesion. So the notion of the intrauterine environment is this highly sensitive environment attuned to both current and past social environments, mediated by the amplifying vector of the mother's body, found its immediate intellectual sources in many social contexts during this period, very charged contexts, one of which is the medical debates around the US black-white birth weight gap. Others are prominent public policy and social science discourses around the intergenerational transmission of trauma in the aftermath of the Holocaust and other major events, right? And I don't have time to talk about that, but you can see how there's a kind of context to this desire to look at the socially embedded body and the intergenerational effects of exposures during this period. Oh, those are some of the quotes again. What I want to say about this period before I take us right up to the present is something about the language. I can only briefly indicate this to you. But there's a development of a way of thinking about the intrauterine environment that is interested not in things like birth defects or really strongly lesioning threats to the life and survival of the baby, but on the idea of very small and subtle perturbations. So this notion of the subclinical deficiency develops. The idea that if a major deficiency is a problem, maybe babies are having micro deficiencies that we can't detect in a medical model, but there are these small, what they would call cryptic, borderline, subclinical, microfactors. The discourse is really interesting here. They're very, very small and maybe not detectable and not clinical, and they're not diseases and they're not disorders, but perhaps the seeds are being planted during the fetal period, and later in life, you have larger effects of those small perturbations. Okay. Now I want to take us forward to the present moment. Epigenetics is a vibrant new area of postgenomic, meaning only in the period after the completion of the major genome sequencing projects over the last 10 years or so, postgenomic life science research. In this area, epigenetics studies how experiences and environments and exposures can affect gene expression. And I'll briefly discuss how epigenetics research is increasingly situating the female reproductive body today as a central site of epigenetic programming and transmission, and as a significant locus of medical and public health intervention. And I really like this image with its notions of kind of good witch, bad witch, and the kind of gendered idea that you can curse a family with the wrong, the good or the bad woman or mother. So what is epigenetics? Very briefly, epigenetics is the study of molecular mechanisms that bring about a heritable or permanent change in gene expression without changing the gene sequence itself. One such mechanism is DNA methylation. That is when a methyl group, CH3, is appended to a physical structure of a DNA molecule. The presence of that structure at a particular gene locus typically prevents gene expression via physical obstruction of DNA transcriptase and other DNA binding proteins. Epigenetic alterations of gene function can be fleeting. They can last 20 minutes, or they can be long-lasting. They can last a life. And they can be passed through cell division from one cell to another. And they can sometimes, some people believe they can be inherited from one generation to another through the gamete, the cytoplasm, or the reconstruction of environmental cues activating the trait in each new generation. Non-human animal studies allowing for experimental manipulation provide the clearest evidence for epigenetic mechanisms of gene expression modification. So I'll give an example. In mice with a gene variant linked to yellow fur color and obesity, if you feed them a methyl-rich diet during gestation, this epigenetically alters gene expression to yield brown offspring of typical body size. Epigenetics is helping to shape public understanding of the promises and prospects of postgenomic science. And once again, we get this notion of mystery, of awe, of wonder from pop science books such as the Epigenetics Revolution, to the Nova series, Ghost in Your Genes, and the Time magazine cover article, Why DNA Isn't Your Destiny. Epigenetics has met celebratory popular reception, characterized by elements of mysticism as well as poetic wonder, humor, hype. And popular writing on epigenetics often projects very nascent, this is a very new field, very nascent findings into practical health advice for everyday life. Maternal-fetal epigenetic programming is a thriving area of current human epigenetics research that investigates how exposures during the prenatal and perinatal periods can induce long-lasting epigenetic changes that lead to adult disease and are potentially passed on to future generations. And this research field has come to be known as DOHAD, or Developmental Origins of Health and Disease. Since the establishment of this field, research into the fetal origins of disease has expanded into a very large area of the fetal environment. Today, aspects of the fetal environment, such as maternal stress and maternal obesity, are of especially keen interest. DOHAD researchers believe that prenatal maternal effects influence development by introducing epigenetic modifications. They hypothesize that the prenatal period is a critical one for epigenetic programming, in which set points for gene expression are imprinted on the fetus, modifying developmental pathways in areas such as metabolism and the brain, and this is often referred to as fetal programming. Because this programming can imprint on a growing female fetus's own gametes as well, the effects of the maternal environment is thought to possibly be intergenerational, passed through the maternal line to grand offspring. Now, I'm just going to have to briefly clip through my arguments. I've been engaging in a lot of discussion and debate about this new research in bioethics context, policy, and research. And in DOHAD research, I argue that the maternal body very strongly emerges as an epigenetic vector and intensified space for the introduction of epigenetic perturbations in development. Epigenetic research on maternal effects advances a model of human inheritance and development that is at once very intellectually exciting and compelling, but it's also one in which the wider social and physical environment can be seen as heritable and a determinant of future biomedical outcomes via discrete biochemical modifications introduced by the amplifying vector of the maternal body. And this model is kind of epitomized by this New Yorker illustration from a 1997 article on fetal origins research, in which a vector of future developmental outcomes extends from the woman's abdomen. While the target of intervention in much epigenetics discourse is the maternal body, right? So you will make changes to the mother's behavior or exposures. The desired outcome of epigenetics-driven health interventions at this point is improved fetal health. DOHAD researchers do hope, of course, that a collateral effect of their policies will be to enhance resources for pregnant women. However, when you closely examine the literature in this field, their proposed interventions are directed toward the most efficient methods to ensure developmentally optimum outcomes for the fetus. The symbols favored by the field on the insignia of its international society or on the cover of one of the field's leading textbooks, the fetal matrix, are fetuses encapsulated in headless, legless maternal abdomens. The maternal body is a transducing and amplifying medium necessary to get to the fetus, an obligatory passage point, not a primary endpoint or subject of DOHAD research. In a recent comment by myself and colleagues in Nature, we looked at the problems in the rapid translation of epigenetics research into advice for mothers, and looked at how the translation of these findings is leading to an overly simplified conception of the science and overlooking the early stage of this science and the need to validate it in humans, and also failing to convey that the effect sizes of findings in this field are very, very small. If we don't surround this new work with the proper scrutiny, and that means putting it in historical context, thinking about it critically from a multidisciplinary perspective, and looking very hard at the empirical claims of the science itself, we could end up with a very different result than many expect from epigenetics, a kind of somatic determinism that marks some individuals as irrevocably marked or lesioned from the start, and that threatens women's full autonomy and reproductive freedom. So what's the gender and science bit in all of this? I just want to conclude with a few ideas for your consideration. Now, the history of maternal effects, I think, helps add a new dimension to our history of medical motherhood and its correlate, the medical conception of the fetus, as a patient with interests, rights, and capacity for suffering. As historians of gender and medicine have documented, in the early 20th century, the 19th century ideal of moral motherhood, in which mothers were held up as moral paragons who constituted the counterpart to the harsh world of male public life and who formed the foundation of a civilized, progressive culture, was displaced by the ideal of medical motherhood, with the advent of public health policy and expert medical advice to mothers designed to improve maternal and infant health outcomes based on scientifically validated interventions. By the mid-20th century, mothers had come to be thought of as vectors for our social and environmental ills, as a potential threat to their current or future offspring, and as in need of expert advice, regulation, and surveillance. And I want to add to this history of maternal-fetal science. And we can place this in this kind of set of changes and track these changes through the history of maternal-fetal science. Historically, maternal-fetal epigenetic programming today converges with several major trends in 20th and 21st century science, gender, and culture, from conceiving of motherhood as instinctual, selfless, and intrinsically moral, to a cultural conception of mothering as an agential project of the self, in which the mother's interests are often perceived to be in tension with the child's. From a psychosocial model of child development to a model in which the critical factors in development are genetic and neurological, and from birth as the moment of personhood and medical concern to conception and even preconception as the focal point of political interest and biomedical intervention and reproduction. I'm also interested in another gendered dimension here. And you'll recall from the beginning of the talk, when we were talking about the very qualities of knowing, the kind of notion that there's an unknowability or an ineffability around maternal effects, or that the belief in maternal effects is woman's knowledge or old wives' tales, that kind of thing. The history of contestations over maternal effects science, I think, goes right to the heart of questions about the power of scientific epistemologies. It is really rich terrain for theorizing about the nature and limits of scientific knowledge as we enter an era in which the sciences of reproduction and bioengineering offer ever more totalizing visions of technological management of human life. So the relationship between human mothers and fetuses is difficult to study. It presents a picture of deeply uncertain and contested knowledge. Despite the veneer of exciting new science, the effect sizes are very small. They offer very little in the way of control or prediction of outcomes. And the progressive advancement of knowledge contrasts sharply with a backdrop of suggestive but unreplicable or empirically controversial results and as yet unknown mechanisms. So take the case of the 9/11 studies that I started with. So at first it looks like you have this really fascinating effect, but if you review a decade of research papers, you just see a mix of contradictory results, small effect sizes, and ultimately no effect of 9/11 on birth outcomes. Nonetheless, the media attention and continued interest in these kinds of claims speaks to a kind of deep intuition that there's something right about that the social kind of ripples through our bodies in some ways. And we are very, very drawn to that in a deep way, and this is what fascinates me. What forms of scientific knowledge result when science encounters spaces that plausibly cannot be known, cannot be managed, cannot be controlled, and cannot be perfected? In what contexts and to what ends do scientists throughout the 20th century and in our present post-genomic age embrace rather than resist the possibility of unknowability? A belief that the mother adds something essential and powerful to the mix of fetal development, despite the persistent empirical underdetermination of such claims, points to the magnificent staying power of beliefs about the ineffable and special link between mother and fetus in our putatively scientific, materialist, and reductionist age. So I've come to call this persistent and resilient, yet often non-cognitive belief that there is something ineffable, irreducibly complex, and special about the mother's contribution to the fetus, that there must be something extra that the mother gives to the growing infant, even if we can't always measure or observe it. I've come to call this the maternal mystique. The persistent mystique of the maternal-fetal relation provokes striking pronouncements by 20th and 21st century scientists on the sublime wonder and ineffability of the maternal-infant relation and the limits of materialist science. So this perplexing and paradoxical persistence of a belief in the ultimate unknowability and mystery of the maternal-fetal interface, so that we keep asking the question even though we get very little results and very little control and very little intervention. And so the persistence in that belief that we can't really know it, alongside the continued belief that its study and its control should be a central aim of modern biomedical science, I think poses fascinating questions at the intersection of science and gender. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So we're going to have some time for questions. So that we can get you on the video, I'll bring the microphone around. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll come to you.
Hi, you mentioned this briefly in the presentation, but I was hoping you could speak a little more about the consequences of the maternal body having agency and how that might reflect on women having not just responsibility, but blame for the fetal outcomes.
Oh, yes. Okay, so what we did in the nature piece, for example. Yeah. So I call this field of science one of high level of responsibility, low level of control. So there are a lot of claims kind of being heaped on the mother, most of which don't have to do with individual behaviors that she could control, but ambient environment. So we're concerned about several levels. One is the accurate perception of risk, the level of effects seen. So you see studies that claim that nutritional deprivation during fetal development can lead to obesity later in life. But you actually look at the study and it shows that people who experience that weigh on average 2.3 kilograms more later in life. And not exactly obesity, right? So the proper interpretation of the degree of uncertainty and the level of risk. Second is the use overwhelmingly of animal models. So most of this research in humans is totally observational. I emphasized that in the talk, that animal models definitely show us that in principle there are epigenetic effects. The extent to which this is true in humans has not yet been well established. Humans have very, very different reproductive systems than mice, for example. We don't have huge litters, we have paternal care, and so on. Developmentally, babies are born at a different stage, and so on. Our placental system is different. And so that's another level of proper conveyance of the results of the science. A lack of emphasis on paternal effects is a major problem in the conveyance of these findings. Increasingly, scientists are looking at paternal effects, which represents a reversal of the very long history of focus on maternal effects. However, in the reportage of the results of the field, as well as in the field of itself, the focus is still disproportionately overwhelmingly on maternal effects. So those are three areas that we focus. The piece is only 1 page long, so you should take a look if you're interested. But surely there are major issues for the focus on modifications to individual women's behavior, or advice for altering an individual woman's behavior. What it looks like to me is that if anything, epigenetics can provide us with one more tool among many for talking about the way that social disadvantage, social and physical environment can, in small ways, yes, but as part of a larger picture, affect our bodies, that we're embedded in our environment. So it provides us one more tool to understand that.
Going off the idea that the maternal body as an environment can actually change the genes, that seems like it has potential implications to really accelerate our ideas of evolution, not only in humans, but in just mammals in general. What does that mean?
So I want to clarify that epigenetic effects don't change the genes themselves. They just change the regulatory mechanisms that turn on and off the genes. So that means that what's inherited is still the same sequence as before. So the significance of epigenetic markings are for in the developmental context rather than in the evolutionary context.
I like placentas. Let's talk about them. Partially methylated domains. The placenta is 450 grams, 20 centimeters. It's one of the only organs in the body that is characterized by this phenomenon of a partially methylated domain. And it seems to me that this is where we should be focusing our investigations and linking it not with behavior, but say outcomes such as autism or schizophrenia. Can we harvest up placentas and measure the percentage of methylation in these areas and link that later on in life to incidents of people falling on a spectrum somewhere?
Oh my goodness. So, I mean, you're right to say that the placenta is really a profound object of interest in this field. It's a fetal organ that is highly important to the growth of the fetus. And all those people in the 60s that I was talking about, they were placentologists, and they were forging that field of placental studies. And only today can we do what you're talking about, which is look at the molecular elements of the placenta. Is the placenta likely to be highly are methylation patterns in the placenta likely to be highly explanatory of things like autism? I'm a historian of science, and so I'm kind of placing this all in context, and I'm unable to offer any sort of prediction about what the science will show. I do think it's important to approach these new epigenetic sciences with a lot of humility and awareness of the hype around them. And with autism research in particular, which I've written about in a totally other context, there are many epistemological considerations. We're thinking about autism, the rise of rates of autism, and so on, that make that a really complex nut to crack. So you've got epigenetics, which is good with very small effect sizes that are not predictive and not controllable. And you have autism, a ridiculously huge big tent kind of concept. On that basis, I'm not philosophically or conceptually very hopeful about, about links there. But undoubtedly, people will be exploring those implications and many, many more.
Ms. Richardson, in the research world you live in, is there ever any talk about a digital download from the mother's brain to the fetus brain via the umbilical cord? Does that subject ever get tossed around?
That sounds like very much like old-style maternal impressions theory, like that the brain and the thoughts and the experiences and so on are somehow going to be transferred to the fetus. No, we're not talking about effects of that nature in any way in this contemporary science. We're talking about a kind of push and pull of biological factors involved in development, leading to small perturbations, so nutritional, metabolic. Certainly the brain is of great interest, but you know that most brain development happens postnatally for humans. So no, there isn't any sort of concept. I mean, that's a radical kind of science fiction notion. I'm not sure if you're thinking about engineering that to be the case, or if people think that's the case. But I think that's one of the clear distinctions we can make between maternal impressions theory and maternal effects. Maternal impressions theory had some very, for what it's worth, kind of crude notions that what the mother sees can directly imprint on the child, or the attitude that the mother has during fetal development becomes the attitude and character of the fetus growing up. We're no longer thinking in those kinds of ways about how that maternal-fetal interface works. It's been a reframing, and that's part of that shift from maternal impressions to maternal effects.
Now, I noticed with some of the history here, there was a lot of the development in the 20th century and the shift within the studies, but also during that time you had a huge shift within the birthing process and even the feeding process. So we had a huge shift from mother's milk to formula. We had a huge shift from home births to suddenly a hospital clinical birth, infants being separated from mother up to, a couple weeks, because somebody else could feed them. And now we're trying to see a shift coming back, but we still have huge changes within the maternal care, how many births are induced, and the induction rate, augmentation rate, as well as cesarean rate. And I was wondering what kind of correlation is all of that taking place, because there is that sort of that fourth trimester, the infant development, the first 3 months right after birth, and the heavily impressioned aspects of that. I mean, you have breast milk that can totally change and affect the digestion tract and the immune system. And so whether or not all of that, how is all of that playing into these studies? How much of that's actually being taken into consideration? Because when you look at just like the DNA methylation and suppressing of gene expression, how much of that is coming into play, looking at it from immediately after birth to just even a day after birth and basing it on, are they getting the mother's colostrum? Are they then, are they being breastfed exclusively for 6 months, or are they being supplemented early on? Are they even getting sugar water during a circumcision? Little things like that, which they are showing have a big play in health and general things like that, but with this interface between the maternal-fetal interface, how much of that is being actually explored and taken into consideration within this entire context?
You make a couple of excellent points. First of all, in my work, I'm focused on maternal-fetal effects, but you can also have maternal effects that are postnatal and perinatal. And so that would be another area to look at. So that you also make the point that there are all of these complex interacting factors in development, from nutrition to intimate connections with the parent during early development, things like the microbiome and so on. And so it underscores how very complex these questions are. So, but to answer your question very, very briefly, yes, people are doing epigenetic studies of all of those things. Epigenetics is an all-purpose tool that you can apply to long-standing questions. The question, though, is, what these studies will show is observationally they may show a change in methylation patterns. The question is, what does that mean? We actually don't know what the normal reference epigenome is. And there may not be a normal one. There might be good epigenomes for different environments, contexts, and so on. So it's all happening very, very quickly. So a finding that says we found a change in methylation, we can't interpret that until we have a reference backdrop of what's good and what's not. Also, we have to know how fleeting or permanent those epigenetic changes are, and that's something that's poorly understood in a human context. So I don't mean to denigrate the science here, but truly, the term epigenetics came into wide usage about 5 years ago. As a historian in time, this is the kind of thing where we have to give it some time for the methodologies to develop and be affirmed. In the Nature piece that I wrote with colleagues from different disciplines, we highlighted other examples in the history of maternal-fetal science where early suggestive findings, though in small studies with small effect sizes, were quickly rushed into use and led to large effects for maternal autonomy, such as the case of crack cocaine usage by pregnant women. In the 1980s, many women lost their children, they lost access to social benefits, they were jailed because they used crack cocaine during pregnancy on the basis of early studies that showed effects on the fetus of using that drug. 20 years later, it's been shown, and this will seem incredible if you have a certain view of how things work, it's been shown there are no long-term effects of use of crack cocaine by my colleagues at the School of Public Health at Harvard. So we have to have patience with the epidemiology required to establish these effects. Otherwise, women's autonomy, whole lives can be changed on the basis of these claims because there's so much anxiety around protecting the fetus, right? And so much likelihood to blame the mother. I'm not suggesting you were suggesting anything along those lines, but it reminds us that we have to have a patience with the science and give it time before we rush it into application.
Towards the end of your lecture, you spoke of the social implications of putting the blame on the mother. However, in your field, have you come across any sort of literature or theories or thoughts about social implications being put on the fetus or the father in this field?
Fascinating, yes. I mean, I am concerned. I did mention the idea of marking children as being lesioned. In the discourse of epigenetic programming, there's this notion that the critical period is the prenatal period, possibly perinatal, and that's when the programming happens. So what do you do with that information? Should we give up on this child and not send them to Head Start? And in fact, I've found claims like this, that it's already been set in the prenatal period. So there are implications for stigma for the fetus or offspring or future infant or child, for sure. And the father question is a really interesting one. So it's an epilogue to this whole story because it's just recently that this question has been formulated as a meaningful and important biomedical question. And I have a colleague who's actually interviewing men and confronting them with these studies and asking how that changes their attitude about various things. Should men stop drinking 4 months before they want to have a baby? You know, you know, and we wouldn't want discourses of blame to equally go to men. That wouldn't be a good outcome, right? So that's not what we're looking for. But is there the possibility of a corrective move where men are encouraged to take greater responsibility for their reproductive health and well-being and for the infant as well as a result of studies that focus on the father? That's a really fascinating and open question, I think, at this point. Really a smart observation.
So my question is definitely not as interesting as all of the other questions. I just noticed that throughout the lecture, especially towards the beginning when you were talking about like sort of knowledge and studies sort of collecting together, like, you know, at the beginning of the century, they used the term quickening, which also obviously is a term related to childbirth. And I just wondered if that was intentional on your part.
If I was having some rhetorical fun. Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Just to note, I mean, this is how pervasive birth and fetal and developmental metaphors are in our very language.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking Sarah Richardson. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you very much to our sponsors, our co-sponsors, our supporters, our wonderful volunteers. So thank you to all of you. I'd also like to let you know that we are in the planning stages for next year's lecture series. Working title is Viruses, Vectors, and Values. So should be quite an interesting series. Please check in on our website, values.utdallas.edu, to learn more later on in the summer, and to join our mailing list if you're not on it. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Have a good weekend.